As welfare established the most wondrous.
We are talking The Exorcism of God. This one is directed and co-written by Alejandro Hidalgo. Although I would say the best way to describe this movie in a kind of nutshell is, what if Michael Bay had directed The Exorcist? Yes, if you like subtle movies, this one may not be for you, but if you like an entertaining but ultimately somewhat kind of silly movie, this may well be your film. Now, what is the story of The Exorcism of God? Well, it focuses on this American priest who is living in Mexico, and he is called to exorcise this woman at the beginning of the movie. However, things don't go according to plan, and he actually commits an act which would be deemed pretty bad by anyone's standard, but maybe particularly kind of when you're a priest during this exorcism. Now, it appears to have worked, but he's kind of carrying this kind of guilt, and this act, this why it went wrong, informs the rest of the story. And it cuts to nearly 2 decades later, and this priest is trying to kind of make penance for what he knows what he's done wrong by trying to give to charity, help children, etc. But he hasn't actually kind of confessed his sins to, like, his superiors, for example. But he's called into action again when there seems to be further possessions, this time with this particular young woman who is being held at this kind of local prison. But this particular exorcism seems to have far-reaching kind of consequences for those around him as well. And like I've said, it's kind of like, what if Michael Bay had directed The Exorcist? That's kind of all I'll say. So first of all, let's talk about what I think works in this movie. If you generally think kind of possession movies and exorcism movies are kind of slow-moving, more cerebral-style horror movies, this one is to watch for you, because it certainly has lots of kind of, I would even say, action set pieces, to be honest with you. Like I've said, there's actually a few different kind of confrontations between kind of demonically possessed and people and the priests as the film goes on. So you certainly kind of won't be sitting around waiting for just the inevitable kind of confrontation at the end. It's actually kind of peppered throughout the movie, and as I say, this movie isn't particularly subtle, and we have lots of kind of like gruesome sort of special effects and disturbing imagery. And I have to be honest with you, quite kind of fun sequences involving, among other things, a kind of demonically possessed Jesus effigy that kind of attacks our priest. Things like this, with all kind of like messed up faces and stuff. There's actually a reasonable kind of body count within the movie. So it kind of goes on at a somewhat of a breakneck pace, unlike, say, a lot of the kind of traditional kind of maybe style exorcism movies. It's not especially gory, but it just has lots kind of going on, and it's maybe more violent, maybe, if not gory, but maybe more violent than a lot of these kind of exorcism movies. There's actually a little bit of humour in there. Our priest kind of gets this help from another kind of priest he's kind of worked with before, and there's actually some kind of quite funny dialogue between the two, I have to say. I thought the special effects work was pretty good. They use a touch of kind of computer enhancement, which looks a little on the cheaper side, but it's relatively kind of like a minor part of the special effects. A lot of the kind of the effects work is kind of done with kind of practical makeup and things like this. And I have to say, we do get some suitably freaky imagery. I actually kind of quite liked this story, even though it's a little bit on the kind of like, as I say, the unsubtle side, without kind of giving any spoilers. It nonetheless is more of an action exorcism film in a lot of ways, but it still has an interesting idea here. And one thing I did like about it is we actually get an idea about what our demonic kind of entity is actually kind of trying to do. One of the things I always wonder with kind of possession movies, and I'm thinking, what is the end game for the demon? What is its purpose of possessing someone? What is it actually trying to accomplish? Here we actually get a reasonable kind of idea about what the actual end game is, so to speak, of this this entity. And I also think the movie does a good job of really kind of like sort of giving you the kind of the backstory, so to speak, of this particular kind of demon, and makes it feel like this one is a particularly kind of nasty one, and it's kind of difficult to deal with, and how kind of dangerous it kind of might be, not just for the priests involved, but for kind of people around them. You've got to kind of think of the collateral kind of damage as well. And I think it ends in a fun way, I have to say. Again, not subtle, but quite a fun way that could potentially set up a kind of a sequel. And, you know, I think more in the long lines of like the kind of like the Paul Bettany kind of Legion, and you know, the Priest movie, stuff like that. Kind of more of a kind of like high octane style kind of demonic hit of battle. I mean, we're not talking like huge stunts and things like that, but it certainly is a lot more going on than some of these kind of possession films. Again, you have to try and excuse myself, Lee. I don't want to give away kind of plot points here. I actually thought the performances were all pretty good. Yeah, so overall I kind of enjoyed it. But let's talk about maybe what doesn't work for me. Those of you who want more of a kind of a realistic, if you can call it that, possession movie, more about kind of character moments and kind of drama, I think maybe put off by the more bombastic kind of side of this kind of movie. You know, the plot makes sense in this film, I will say, in the context of the universe that it's creating. To me, I actually thought it kind of worked pretty well, but it certainly isn't subtle, and there is like, you know, maybe it goes a little bit too far sometimes with kind of the, certainly there's a kind of a sequence in the end with it in this kind of prison where it almost goes into kind of like Assault on Precinct 13 sort of territory in a lot of ways, and kind of almost feels like a zombie flick in some respects. But I actually still kind of enjoyed it. I actually kind of quite like a different kind of style of an exorcism movie, but ultimately I can see why people might think this was going a little bit too much, and maybe a little bit too kind of cheesy at times. So, you know, it does kind of go on that balance where if you're a fan of like the original Exorcist movie, you'll think this one is maybe just on the kind of the sillier side, unfortunately, and it kind of maybe goes a little bit too far with certain kind of sequences at least. This is partially spoke in Spanish language, so obviously those of you who don't like kind of foreign language films, it's something to be aware of. There's probably about 40% of the movie is kind of spoken in Spanish. It's not really a criticism, but I feel I have to obviously make mention of that. I think it kind of becomes a little bit predictable, if we're being honest, where things are kind of set up, and you know that they're going to have to be kind of like paid off a little bit down the line. You know, a character will say something, and you can say, okay, well that's clearly what's going to happen down the line, because we're sort of setting it up so early, so that the movie becomes a little bit kind of somewhat kind of predictable at the end. I mean, it actually goes on for maybe longer than I thought. Kind of maybe it has an epilogue for maybe longer than I would initially anticipate. But there it is. I have to say as well, those of you who don't like jump scares will maybe think this movie relies a little bit too heavily on jump scares, because oh boy, there's a lot of them in this movie. It kind of goes maybe has a few too many, to be honest, and maybe lacks that kind of like that creepiness factor that maybe you would expect from a horror film like that, in favour of, as I say, more of a bombastic kind of film. And it certainly kind of, let's just call it homages, horror movies of its past. The sequence at the beginning of the movie, which is straight out of the original Exorcism film. So part of the critiques, I would say, of this movie, it's going to be more of a taste thing, but I do feel it is maybe a little bit of a dumb movie in a way, but I thought it was hella entertaining. I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I kind of quite enjoyed this one, and I have to say it had me hooked, and it had a kind of a sheen, kind of professional kind of feel to it, that I feel made this movie kind of like feel like it had a reasonably kind of high production value, and just this sort of slightly different kind of tone to an Exorcism movie made it feel quite interesting. But yeah, it does kind of like reuse certain scenes that you've kind of seen before in other films. For me personally though, I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I actually kind of quite enjoyed it. But those of you who like more of a character-driven, thoughtful exorcism movie with more basis on kind of like, you know, faith over fantastical, then maybe this one isn't for you. 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.